Welcome to an SFB Addict video.
SFB Addict here. We have another campaign game for the cadet game that we're running. It's going to be a Romulan Firehawk cadet cruiser versus a Federation cadet cruiser fighting over this mineral world. So here we have the Federation with 2 photons, 3 phaser 1s, 2 phaser 3s, and the Romulan has 2 plasma F torpedoes, 2 phaser 1s, 3 phaser 3s. So the Federation is a purely direct fire race, whereas the Romulan is a plasma chucker. And it does have a little bit of direct firepower, but most of its firepower is point blank defensive fire with the phaser 3s. Okay, now with the energy allocations, the Romulan basically comes in with his cloak paid for and going speed 14. And not much else is going on there. The Federation, on the other hand, is coming in holding 2 overloaded photons. He's moving speed 15 and he's holding 1 wild weasel. Now he did allocate his energy allocation for him in a manner that isn't standard, so let me bring that over here. Whoops. There we go. So he's got 2 battery available, but he doesn't discharge it. But when you count up his 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, it doesn't leave the 1 point for the weasel. So this should have actually been 1 point discharged, so that he would have a total of 21 used. Okay, so most of this game is maneuvering. So I'm just going to quickly zip through the playback here, and we're basically only going to stop when they do something interesting. Okay, so again, the Romulan's coming in speed 14, the Federation is coming in speed 15. So since they've got the planet between the two of them, we just decided to jump 4 or 5 impulses at a time. That's why the ships are just zooming along here. Now you notice the Fed has just turned down at this point. Oh, here, let me open up the Frax window. It's got the impulse collar in it. There. So at this point we're 14 impulses into turn 1. So right now the Fed's just turned down, and the Romulan has a choice. He can either go up and over or down and under. Well, if he goes down and under, he's walking straight into the FA arc of the Fed, so he's going to go up and over. But he could, at this point, launch 2 shuttles to sort of cut off the Federation. Now, the 2 shuttles aren't going to be that big of a threat to the Federation, but it will chew up weapons fire, and it could take out 3 to 8 points off of his shield, depending on whether or not he's got reinforcement on it. But anyway, this was a decision point in turn 1. That was the end of turn 1. Okay, so energy allocation for turn 2. The Federation is still holding. He throws 6 points of power into reinforcement on his number 1, and he slows down to speed 10. And again, he makes a minor mistake on his energy allocation where he basically is paying 19 power out of his 20 generated, if I count that correctly. He's actually discharged his batteries and has paid 21. But it's documented incorrectly. But the total power usage does indeed work out to be 21 out of 22 which is what he says he has, but one of the batteries would have actually had to have been discharged on turn 1, which means he would have indeed had only 21. And the Romulan coming in on this turn is coming in speed 14, again paying for his cloak, but here he discharges 2 battery, but he's documented that incorrectly. That would actually be 2 battery discharged during the turn, not at the energy allocation phase of it. But that's okay. So again, Romulan speed 14, Fed has slowed down to 10. So turn 2 is progressing. And again, we're just jumping impulses here while the planet is blocking them. We're just doing a rather quickly movement. So even right here at this point, the planet is still blocking. At this point, they almost had a clean line of sight, but the Fed moved forward, I believe. Now here the Fed dives in to stick close to the planet. What the Fed could have done is he could have side-slipped to this hex and then turned and then side-slipped, kind of thing. Or you could have gone wide and out, down and around this way, and then turned back around. But he's kind of locked himself into a particular pathway here at this point. But anyway, let's play out what actually did happen. So the planet is still blocking them. At this point, let me zoom in. So right now, they have a clean line of sight. So if I bring up the range finder, this little red line is not being blocked by the planet, so it is the line of sight, and it is a range of 2. And the Romulan decides to launch his plasmas. But you notice the Romulan does move on 13 and 14, and we'll see what happens.
Thinking.
Okay, so the plasmas have been placed on the board.
Thinking.
Emergency deceleration.
Okay, so the Romulan wanted to call for fire. The Fed decided to call emergency deceleration, which means he will move at his current speed of 10 for the next 2 impulses, but on the 14th impulse he is then going speed 0 and can at that point launch a Wild Weasel.
Ready.
And for some firing, we have the Romulan firing 2 phaser 1s at the Fed. And we have the Fed firing 2 phasers, which are also phaser 1s. The left side one, which can fire directly back, and the right side one, which can fire directly back, firing back at the Romulan. So the exchange of fire is 11 points of damage and 12 points of damage. But you'll notice that it is the Romulan side shield that's getting hit. And he decides to reinforce. And the Fed actually takes internal damage, but only 1 point, but he loses an impulse engine. So that is after the exchange of fire. So the Romulan draws first blood without even using his plasmas at this point. Now, if this were me in this situation, I would have additionally fired the 2 phaser 3s, because at range 2, a phaser 3 does 4 points maximum, 1 point minimum. So if we were to add this up, that's 18 total, divided by 6. Which statistically is a roughly 3 points per weapon fired. Now he could roll 2 6s and do 2, but then again he could roll average and do 6, or he could roll really well and do 8. But if we take a look at phaser 1, at that same range, it's going to be a maximum of 7 and a minimum of 3. But if we add up those numbers at range 2, it's 7 plus 6 plus 5 plus 4 plus 4 plus 3, which is 29, and you divide that by 6, and it equals 4.8. So a difference of average 3 versus average 4.8 damage at this range. The phaser 3s are almost as good as the phaser 1s. So he could have done about another 6 damage roughly internal to the Fed if he had fired his phaser 3s in addition to that. But anyway, back to what actually did happen. So the next impulse, the Romulan and the plasma moved. Now here is where the Romulan made a mistake. If the Romulan had moved to this hex, then he would have had a line of sight almost a line of sight. So the planet just barely blocks it. So it didn't make a difference, but he almost could have prevented the Fed from doing what the Fed's about to do. But unfortunately, not quite. But by going where he did go, there was absolutely no chance of avoiding it. And what happened is the Fed sideslipped and put the planet between himself and the plasmas. So at this point, the plasmas and the ROM ship are blocked by the planet. The plasmas accept the planet as the target. There was a slight chance, if the Romulan had sideslipped, he might have maintained lock, but wouldn't have. But where he did go, it was guaranteed that he would not have. So the plasmas here take to the planet. The next movement, they hit the planet. They are both real plasmas. So at this point, it's a really bad day for the Romulan. Okay, so the Romulan closes, bringing his damaged shield closer.
No actions.
And the Federation at this point decides to fire with his phaser 3s. Now again, when they were off of each other's shields earlier, he could have fired them at that point, which would have punctured the shield and done internals, but by waiting until this impulse, he was saving them for the plasmas. But now at this point, it is going to puncture through the shield, and it's going to do more damage than it would have at the previous range. So, 2 phaser 3s does 6 damage to the Fed. And the Romulan is returning fire with 2 phaser 3s. So he's got an RX phaser here that arcs, and he's got a left side phaser that also arcs. And he rolls 2 2s, which is 8 damage. and the Fed is doing 6 internals to the Romulan. So 2 warp hits, a lab hit, battery hit, hull hit, and a shuttle hit. And then we continue on with the movements. Romulan decides to get out of dodge at this point, which is what he should have done the movement before instead of continuing to close with the Fed. And that's the end of the turn. So, turn 3. So, energy allocations on turn 3. The Romulan begins rearming his plasmas. He puts power back into his phasers, slows down to speed 8, and pays for cloak. Now you notice that he's paid for cloak on the first turn and didn't use it. He's paid for cloak on the second turn and didn't use it. The Federation on turn 3 is now down to 19 power, and he begins rearming. He hasn't fired his photons yet, but he's still holding his 2 overload photons. He starts rearming his phasers. He's going speed 8. And he pays for a tactical maneuver, and he's no longer paying for a wild weasel. So that was Impulse 32. The Federation launches a shuttle. Okay. So, beginning of the new turn, the speeds are speed 6 and speed 8. The Fed is trying to go for speed 8, but he's in the post-emergency deceleration restriction stage, which means his ship is still speed 0, even though he's trying to go speed 8. He has to pay for the movements he's not going to use. But because he is still speed 0, that does mean that he can use tactical maneuvers. And Romulan decides to cloak. And the Fed decides to fire. And he fires a right side phaser 1, which is now range 4 to the Romulan. And rolls a 1. Which is 5 damage. Romulan turns on his next movement to bring a better shield to bear. And the Federation does a tactical maneuver. On this impulse, he decides to fire, and he's firing.
Open fire window.
2 photons and his FA phaser 1. So his 2 photons FA and his phaser 1 here. The phaser rolls a 3, and the photons, one rolls a 1 and hits for 16, and the other rolls a 6 and misses. So that's 19 damage, hitting the number 4 shield on the Romulan, which is an 8-point shield, so that's going to be 11 internals. So there is the damage. He's now got 3 warp gone, an impulse gone, 2 APR gone, 2 battery gone, both shuttles gone, and a phaser 3 and an impulse gone. At this point, the Romulan is cloaking, and the Federation is pretty much out of weapons. So let me zoom back out. and we are just basically jumping through impulses 2 or 3 or 4 at a time at this point.
No actions.
Now, the Fed did try to maintain lock-on to the Cloaking Federation, but he missed the roll. He needed to roll a 1 or a 2 and ended up rolling a 6. Okay, so that was the end of the turn there. So we're now coming in on turn 4. Federation is now starting to arm his photons, and he increases his speed to 15. But again, because of the emergency deceleration post-restriction period, he's not actually able to go speed 15 yet, so it'll be going speed 10 for a little bit. And the Romulan, at this point, is second turn of arming of his Plasma F. He's again paying for Cloak, and he's going speed 6. Now at this point, both Fed and Romulan are able to start using continuous damage repair and start repairing internal damage to their ships. So the Fed comes in at speed 10 trying to go 15, and the Romulan is going slow. And then we have a roll to try and regain lock-on, and he fails.
King. Ready. No actions.
At this impulse, the Federation is now able to go the actual speed 15. Okay, so here we missed the few Romulan moves. Was calling speed 6 for the shuttle. He was missing his movements on his counter, and I didn't catch on to that. So we backed up for the Fed movements. The Romulan did the movements he missed out on, and the Fed readjusted his moves. So that's what's happening right now. So the Fed didn't go straight down, he instead turned and circled. When the Romulan ship is cloaked, not much happens. Okay, so the Fed repaired an impulse by the end of the turn, and the Romulan repaired an APR. And the Fed is starting to use repair points now that there's no longer internal damage to repair shields. Okay, so this new turn coming up. The Romulan is coming in speed 3, paying for cloak, and is on the last turn of arming of his plasmas. But you'll notice that the Fed is staying off of his down number 4. The Federation is overloading one of his now armed photons. The other one is being held as a standard, increases or decreases the speed to speed 12. So the Fed's speed is 12, and the Romulan speed is 3.
No actions.
And there is a speed 6 shuttle still on the board. Okay, I'm going to zoom the map back in again. And let me zoom out these SSDs for the Fed and ROM. So here the Fed is going much faster than the Romulan. The Romulan turns to try and present something other than a down shield towards the Fed. And the Fed here side slips, where he could have gone forward and been directly off the down shield. And then on this impulse could have turned and been right on the same hex as the Romulan off the down shield and could have fired phasers at the cloaked ship. They do reduced damage from anywhere from 50% down to 25%, but at range 0, while he's cloaked, the range is actually range 5, and at range 5 on a phaser 1, you're guaranteed to hit. So if this 2 hits, it gets reduced to might get reduced to 50% or 25%. So this roll of a 6 is the only place where he does 0 damage. Everything else hits and does damage, although it could be reduced by 50% or down to 25%, but is on a down shield. So he missed out on an opportunity there.
No actions.
So the Fed does not fire, overshoots.
Thinking.
At this point, instead of having the movement chart in the non-used Frax player window, we decided to put it on the map, simply because the players kept asking what moves on this impulse too many times when they could have been looking at the chart themselves, so I put it on the map so it's there. But as you see, it gets reduced in size with reduced map zooming, so it's a little bit harder to see sometimes that way. Okay, so we start calling impulses. Let me adjust that again. Okay, we're on the last impulse. And for some reason the Romulan turns down. Now it could be that he didn't want the shuttle to be off the down shield, but the fact is the Romulan is cloaked and the shuttle had no chance of hitting him while cloaked at that range. Or I should say he had a very small chance. He had a chance of rolling 1 or 2 for 1 point of damage, and then there's a very good chance it would have been reduced to 50%, which would have been 0 damage, or to 25%, which would have been 0 damage. But anyway, it might have been a better idea to turn this direction, down into this hex right here, so that the plasmas would have been arcing towards the Fed, decloak, launch, and then go right back into cloak. But anyway, This is what the Romulan has decided to do.
Thinking.
Okay, so we're into the next turn, allocation for energy. So on this turn, the Fed begins overloading the photon that was held as a standard, reduces speed to speed 11, and is starting to put power towards fixing shields. So he's got 2 and 4 for a photon so far, so that's 6. That's a 12-point overload, and the other one is a 16-point overload. The Romulan is now holding his plasmas. He's increasing his speed to speed 13. He's put 3 reinforcement on the number 4 shield, which is actually down, which doesn't help him any. Sorry, no, yep, that's 4, yep. From what I thought was shield 5. And he stops paying for cloak on this impulse. That 3 points would have been better spent as 2 points into general reinforcement for 1 reinforcement on that down shield. But anyway, that's that for allocation. So the Romulan is coming in and is decloaking immediately.
No actions.
So the Romulan is slowly fading in. The Romulan is now turning his plasmas back towards the Federation. He's still decloaking. It's 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and out. He's now at 3.
No actions.
He's now at 2. Now at 1.
Thinking. Thinking. Thinking.
And the Federation decides to fire.
Open fire window.
And the Federation is firing. 1 phaser 1. And he rolls a 6 at range 2 plus 1. And the Federation shuttle is also firing and misses. And now we are completely decloaked for the Romulan at range 2. Oh, Fed decided not to do that for movement. Fed is slide slipping to the right to make it range 3. And the ROM decides to launch. Now you notice the shield that's here is this 5 shield. If I were the Romulan in this position, I probably would have bolted 1 plasma F, possibly both, or launched 1 and bolted the other and fired phasers. But anyway.
Thinking. No actions.
No actions. Launching weapon.
So on this impulse, the Romulan decides to launch the second plasma.
Emerges no acceleration.
And the Fed is declaring emergency deceleration, but according to his energy allocation form, he does not have a wild weasel.
Thinking.
And at this impulse, the Fed fires a phaser 3 at the Romulan. and it was through the down number 6 shield that he fired. And the 2 phaser 3s he fired from his Fed ship into the Romulan ended up doing 7 damage. So he rolled for 4 damage and 3 damage on the 2 dice and did more internals. Let me adjust the map. On this impulse, the Fed launches a Wild Weasel that his energy allocation form says he does not have, because he did not continue paying for it.
Call Bay operations.
But we didn't know this at the time. So the plasmas hit the Wild Weasel. The Fed takes some minor damage to number 2 from the collateral from the plasma. But what would have happened here is the plasmas were in 50-27 and 51-27 to 50-27. Okay, so he would have taken the number 6 shield for 20. Which would have been 8 internal here. And he would have taken 20 on number 5, which would have been 10 internals here, which would have been 18 internals on the Federation at this point. Which would have taken out probably about half his systems. But that would have been if they were both real. And here the plasma is 1 fake and 1 real. So it would have been the number 5 shield taking 10 internals.
No actions.
And for some reason the Romulan still has a plasma on board and is turned off. Fed repairs a shield box.
Thinking.
And he's actually repaired far too many. And then they come in with the new
No actions.
turn. The Fed is going speed 10, and the Romulan is going speed 10. So on this impulse, Romulan begins arming the plasma, and he's paying the rest into movement. Federation begins rearming photons, pays 10 to movement, and pays 5 into reinforcement on his number 1 shield, and recharges some phasers.
No actions. Thinking.
So at this point the Romulan is able to launch the other plasma.
Thinking.
Launch automatically status.
The cloak here was an accident. He's launching a plasma, is what he meant to click. He fills out the plasma card, launches the plasma,
Fire window.
and the Fed was firing. And it fired 1 phaser 1 at the Romulan. It is an up shield. Just does some shield damage.
Thinking.
Open fire window.
Thinking.
So on this impulse, the shuttle phaser 3 is firing, ship's phaser 1, and 2 photons are firing at the Romulan. And 2 phaser 1s are firing from the ROM back at the Fed. And this is another mistake. We lost count as to what turn was what and what the arming cycle was on the Federation's photons. The Federation doesn't actually have photons ready to fire on this turn. The photons were fired as overloads on turn 6. This is turn 7. It's actually his first turn of arming. But this is something like 5 in the morning, and easy enough to get a little bit loopy, I guess, at that hour, and was a mistake on the arming. So, Federation takes some damage. And the ROM takes some damage, and actually is blown up from the photons that he does not have. Plasma travels, chases, and damage. Now you notice this shield had too many repair points on it. And at this point, the Fed is damaged. Now, what happened in the way the game played out, this Romulan-like cruiser now arrives at the battle, and the Federation decides to leave. However, we've made a couple mistakes here in the way the game played. The Fed should have taken the other plasma torpedo instead of having it weaseled, because he did not have a weasel, which would have been about another 10 internals. But that would not have destroyed the ship. But it may have put in question his ability to reach the warp point to disengage. At this point, the new Romulan ship is coming in at range 30 from the Fed, so the Fed just puts everything he has in the movement and goes away. But if he's missing half of his warp engine, that's a little bit harder to do. So the way this game probably would have played out, if we had noticed that the Fed did not arm his weasels properly, and he didn't have the 2 photons to do all this damage on the last impulse, is the Fed probably would have tried to disengage with slightly more damage. So we're going to need to make an adjustment to the way the battle played out. But anyway, the mistakes being set aside, it did turn out to be a fairly interesting battle. And that's the way it turned out. So, have fun playing Starfleet battles. See you next video.